I think it's safe to assume that we all know the world's been turned upside down and that we anticipate the world being disrupted every day now. In the post-pandemic world, we're dealing now with unprecedented demand and strains on the system, and at the same time, a dedication to responsibility and sustainability, and perhaps a new definition of both of those words. Christian just talked about lessons learned. Today, I think we're also going to talk about some lessons applied. So to get things started, I'd like to invite to the stage Dr. Ripin Kalra, who is the Technical Director for Innovation, Urban Resilience, and Sustainability for ICF. Doctor. Jason Hunter, yes, of course, please. Where are you? There he is, Jason Hunter, the Senior Global Practitioner for the Blue Ocean Global Network, and Tim Harris, who is the Chair of the South African Board of Tourism. Please welcome our panel. We can stop the music now. Thank you. Jason, I'm going to kick things off, I'm going to ask Jason to come up with a few remarks. Jason?
Good morning. I'm Jason Hunter. As you can tell by my accent, I'm American who lives in Spain and works in France and globally. I'm here to talk about one of our projects that we do with the Blue Ocean Strategy Network. First of all, what is Blue Ocean Strategy? It's not about the ocean. It's a business strategy development paradigm and approach. It works in the private sector very effectively to help companies create new value, create new business models, create new people propositions. But my background is in international relations, especially in global cities. And so I've been applying this business paradigm to the public and private sector in cities. In cities, we're trying to, instead of trying to extract more value out of each destination city, we're trying to create new value from the bottom up. I mean, could you imagine a Fortune 500 company spending 95% of its budget on marketing, trying to extract value out of a city? That's what our DMOs are doing. So we're trying to flip that script and start focusing on how do we create new business, how do we create new value for the local citizens who are usually left out of global cities, and at the same time meet our demands on addressing the needs of our global customers. Now, one of the projects that I'm working on for the last several years has been in South Africa. And in South Africa, as you know, it's an incredible tourism industry, but in the urban centers, it's more of a transit point. I've been working in South Africa for 30 years, and I know the cities, especially Cape Town, Johannesburg, Durban, have a lot to offer, but tourists are now just skipping over them. So for the past 2 years, I've been working on a project with the French government and the South African government to help raise the capacity of their entrepreneurs in strategy and innovation. At the same time, they're partnered with a municipality figure who is their mentor on what the municipality, what the cities need. And then thirdly, we work with global international corporations to give advisement to these young entrepreneurs. And so we're developing many, many small businesses from the ground up, especially in urban tourism. And these are some of the things we'll talk about today.
Thank you, Jason. We'll come back to Jason in a little bit. You know, it's been said that you cannot manage something unless you can measure it. Our next guest knows a little bit about that. Doctor?
Thank you, Peter. So, just before I start, I just want to have a raise of hands. How many of you checked the weather forecast and you said, oh my God, it's raining in Seville? And it was my reaction too, but actually it's really interesting because rain is actually very good for Seville. It's good for the farmers, it's good for, it gives you a pleasant breeze. Last night there was a nice pleasant breeze blowing around. So rain is actually very good for you. It might not be the most important thing you want to see. You want to experience Seville in sunny weather, but rain is actually very good for Seville. So my initial reaction when I saw the weather forecast last week was, oh, I might not be able to walk around as easily in the rain as possible, but actually my next reaction was, this is great news. And it was confirmed when I got into the bus. There was a couple of people saying, it's nice, it's raining. So I think the travel industry needs to also embrace things which are good for the city, good for the local people, good for the local economy, look for the local environment, and make it as part of the tourism experience as anything else. We do a lot of work at ICF with the resilience of cities, with climate preparedness, future-proofing of cities, and so on. And one of the things we are noticing a lot, particularly in small cities, which have not experienced tourism with large groups, but are starting to open out to tourism, is that they're extremely vulnerable. You go to a small city in Kazakhstan, which is on the erstwhile Silk Route, and there are people you meet in the tourism departments who say, we've never dealt with a group of 15 before. If 15 people turn up together at the same time asking questions, they have a problem. They have not dealt with that before. If 20 people descend on a single hotel as a group, they may not have dealt with the water and the mobility issues that come with moving that group around to the nearest point of interest and so on. And this is what we are trying to capture in our experience with the mayors, with the operators of tourism within these small cities, in Asia particularly, in Nepal, a place like Pokhara, a place like Shymkent in Kazakhstan, where we are finding that at the core of it, building capacity of the local communities, building capacity of the local tourism operators, tourism departments, destination managers, is how to deal with tourism as it opens up and scales out more widely beyond the larger cities and into the smaller ones. But I'll just leave you with this before I pass into the next one, is that clean water, enough water, and clean air are two fundamental things which are not just good for tourism, but also good for the local residents. It's good for all. And the tourism and travel industry, as part of its efforts to create resilience and sustainability, needs to lock in a very strong way with making sure that there is sufficient water and there's good clean air, because that's ultimately the asset that is not only good for the local communities, but also the asset that people come for in a city. They come for peace, some good clean air, and some fresh experience. So let's embrace the environment, let's embrace resilience and sustainability, and that's what we need to get into our plans with the local cities. So that's what we do.
Thanks, Doctor. And we'll come back to you in a second. For the ministers who are in the room, or people who happen to know tourism ministers, let's go back to a definition of terms about the way they even define their own jobs. At least in my experience, ministers of tourism either live or die by numbers. Number of visitors, average stay, average spend. It's all about growing those numbers, and of course that model no longer works. Doctor, you just talked about building capacity. There are so many destinations in the world right now that are trying to limit it. And I want to talk about that. And please welcome Tim Harris, the chairman of the Tourism Board of South Africa.
Thanks very much, Peter. I think to pick up that point you just made, the one thing I know about all of our destinations in Africa is that we are experiencing the opposite of over-tourism. For us, we need more tourists everywhere. Even in a successful tourist city like Cape Town in South Africa, even the most frequented sites, something like Table Mountain, still could use more visitors. So actually, there's a kind of duality in the global conversation about tourism. We appreciate, and we're looking down the road to what Europe is managing in the north in terms of over-tourism. But really, for us, it's about demand creation and getting, firstly, back to the numbers that we had before. South Africa's only at 80% recovery from pre-COVID. But then about driving tourism growth further in the interest of creating jobs. So why are we doing that? Because this question of urban tourism is super important and relevant for Africa, but also Europe. By 2030, there will be 2.4 billion citizens in Africa. The vast majority of those will be young, and they'll be living in cities. So one of the things we ask ourselves often in Africa is how are we going to create jobs for all of those young people? Where are those jobs going to come from? How do we keep young Africans sustainably engaged at home so that we're not contributing further to migratory pressures that you know all about here in the south of Europe? It's a fascinating question, and I think part of the answer, Peter, is tourism. Tourism is going to be creating those jobs for those young people if we can get our policies right and if we can get those visitors to appreciate not just South Africa as a world-class tourist destination, but all of the destinations emerging across the continent. So I'm not sure if you start thinking through that as an opportunity that there's a single more important consideration for the future of Africa than taking our destinations across the continent onto the world stage and making sure that they become viable tourism industries that create millions of sustainable jobs for young Africans. And that is a question about urban tourism. Jason mentioned the country I'm from, South Africa. Our urban spaces are still defined by the policies of apartheid. We had a system until the early 90s that was designed on keeping people apart, as you know, and a lot of that was about keeping people apart from the productive centers. So one of our challenges across the cities that Jason mentioned, Johannesburg, Durban, Cape Town, is making sure that those exclusive urban spaces in the CBDs not only become productive for business, but actually also become viable tourist destinations in their own right. And that is a question about integration. For us, it's about getting not just tourism transport right, but public transport, allowing citizens in our cities to access opportunity in the urban centers. And because we haven't always got that right, we've seen the emergence of new CBDs around the old CBD. It's a highly inefficient outcome because the historical capital base, the assets are sitting in the central business district. So tackling the legacy of apartheid and using urban tourism as a driver to do that is a really big priority for us. One of the ways we're doing it is through MICE, through conferencing. Now, South Africa is the leader for MICE tourism across Africa, but we've also worked over the years with emerging successful players in MICE tourism like Rwanda, like Ethiopia, like Kenya. And I do believe that the MICE industry will be a big part of driving urban tourism as a job creator across the continent. One of the things that happens when your central cities become successful conferencing destinations and support the whole MICE tourism ecosystem is that if you get that those policies right and you secure that successful economy, you end up creating actually a space that can also work for local business. So in the city that I'm from, Cape Town, there's a fascinating reality when we survey citizens around our cities. So the CBD of Cape Town, full of conferencing hotels, the Cape Town Convention Center, a really, I think, an interesting example of an urban tourism success on the continent. But when you survey citizens who live in the townships, who live in informal settlements, they will tell you that they feel safer in the CBD than they do at home. So you can see how creating urban touristic spaces actually is deriving benefits for locals as well, supporting business and entrepreneurship, like Jason said, in urban spaces off the back of turning them into tourist destinations. One of the reasons why that happened, and I think this is relevant right across South Africa, is this idea of partnership between government and business. So we are in an ongoing mission, Peter, to win the lobbying effort with government around tourism as a contributor to GDP. It's about 8% of South Africa's GDP comes from tourism and about 7% of our jobs. But once you can convince the public sector to prioritize tourism, it starts opening up incredible opportunities to build a bridge between government and business. So the reason why Cape Town's central business district works for tourism and as an economic space is because of a partnership created between government and business 20 years ago that added additional security and cleaning to protect business, to protect tourists, and to restore the functional space or preserve the functional space in the CBD. But that partnership wouldn't have been possible if we weren't able to convince the politicians and decision makers that doing this would not just be a benefit for local business, but also help us to create a much more diverse tourism offering across the city. And of course, once you've done that, once you've built those partnerships, it opens up, I think, Peter, the opportunities to drive sustainability and to deal with the climate crisis. And I don't think anywhere in the world faced the situation that we did as early as we did when 4 years ago we almost ran out of water in Cape Town. We had a historic drought, and you would have seen that the strategy of the city to reduce water consumption was built around projecting the date that the water would run out. We called it Day Zero. It sounded like a disaster movie, and that was by design. It was a fear-based campaign to get people to stop using water. What happened is a historic reduction in water usage, 70% reduction in water usage by citizens. Now, 95% of the water in Cape Town is used by residents at home and industry. So that was a massive contribution to making sure we made it through the drought. Of course, at the time I was running the destination marketing organization, it wasn't very useful telling the world that there was a Day Zero coming in Cape Town when we were busy telling them they should come and visit. So the way we won that argument was by using that government-business relationship and convincing the tourism sector, convincing locals, and convincing business that tourism was a net contributor to our economy and a very small user of water. We obviously worked with tourists to make sure that they changed their behavior, but in the end, in the face of a campaign that used a negative message to change consumer behavior, we managed to keep tourism open. And I think that shows an example of how more and more cities are going to have to build that resilience to achieve climate change objectives, but also make sure that tourism remains a driver of job creation and development in our cities. And I can tell you, as Africa looks to questions around flight shaming, to questions around long-haul travel, that is the one thing that keeps our economies going and keeps conservation going across Africa. So if you're working with your stakeholders on understanding the environmental impact of long-haul travel, don't forget to take into account the jobs, the livelihoods, and the wild spaces that are being preserved solely by long-haul travel in South Africa and across the African continent. That is one message, Peter, that we want to land very strongly at this conference today. Make sure you're taking into account the social impact, the environmental impact of long-haul travel when you're assessing the climate impact of your flights. Thank you.
Turn this on? Or either of the, there we go. Thank you so much. Thank you, Tim. You know, I throw this both to Jason and Ripin, and that is, we all know that travel and tourism is an economic driver, it's a job creator, but we're dealing with certain parts of the world right now, Africa being one of them, Saudi Arabia being another, where the average age of the countries, right, there are more people under the age of 35 than anywhere else. So you have an opportunity here for a pipeline of training and education. Everything that you just talked about doesn't happen without training and education. How are we doing that?
Well, that's one of the biggest challenges, is that for training and education in the Global South, you need the experience. And to have the experience, you need to be part of the formal economy, when most of the youth are part of the informal economy, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, with sub-30-year-old unemployment over 50%. Even look at Spain, look at the unemployment in Spain, under 30 years old, enormous. And it needs that access to the market. Even access to the physical market, the CBD, can be very, very difficult in many parts of the world. And so it needs to bring to, cities are made to segregate, period, in most of the world, unfortunately. Because where there's surplus in capital, there's a deficit in capital somewhere else, and that's how it works. And part of that is leveling it out, opening up access, opening up the training, opening up the guidance for these youth, especially in the Global South, to thrive.
So how do you develop, as you were saying earlier, Tim, a private-public partnership where it's incumbent upon the private sector to realize that they need to provide the training, not necessarily the government?
Yeah.
You're on, yeah.
So I think the question of training is really important, but training doesn't have to be in a classroom. And the private sector is very good at on-the-job training as well. It's really interesting. I talk to a lot of, every time I travel to a different city, wherever I'm staying, I do talk to the people working in the, whether it's a hotel or the restaurant, or whether it's the bus operator and so on. And one of the key messages which comes out, particularly from young people, and thanks for bringing that issue up, they also want to go out and look at the world. They don't want to be doing that role forever. And I think
Well, maybe they want to do that role, but they want to do it somewhere else.
somewhere else. And I think there is a fantastic opportunity, because the tourism sector is very well networked around the world, for city-to-city exchanges. There are private sector operators which operate in multiple cities, multiple locations. And a bit like the Erasmus, they can be the Erasmus of tourism, where you travel, you take people who are learning and doing in one place to learning and doing in another place, build that cultural and cross-location experience, which is going to be a win-win for many young people, because they can, other people come and learn, let's say, between Shymkent and Nepal, in Pokhara, and vice versa. They learn how to deal with different types of tourism, different types of people, different types of systems, which are extremely important. And I think that will be a good way to build.
But that also calls into question government involvement in visas.
Yeah.
And open skies in terms of free flow and travel.
Yeah.
Tim?
So there's a good question for a South African. That battle that I was talking about, convincing government about the impact of tourism, is centered largely around lobbying around visas and around flights and access. Again, it gets to that first point I made about how we have a demand problem. We're not dealing with over-tourism. We're dealing with the opposite. We're dealing with under-tourism.
That should be your marketing campaign.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, the one thing that we'll often get, and I'm sure if there was a question, many of you would say, well, surely the problem in South Africa is risk, right? It's about safety issues. What's interesting is, I think urban tourism is a bellwether of whether you're on top of those issues or not. It's really easy to create security in a privatized space, right? If you have a resort or a shopping center, you put up a big wall, you put a guard at the gate, and you ensure security. I think urban tourism happening in the kind of free, open economy, which you can't secure entirely, is a test of whether your system is actually working properly, whether the fundamentals are healthy. And I think it's a mixed story in South Africa. But certainly the trend is in a positive direction in cities like Cape Town and even the city that I'm from, Durban. But it is a key question of not just state capability, but those partnerships, whether you can make the space functional as a tourist destination. There will be huge spin-offs for economic growth and the space as a spur of business and entrepreneurship too.
But of course, it also gets into destination management and how you do it. I mean, we've all seen the examples of Venice and Barcelona, and each city saying they don't want to be the other city. Venice putting in a $5 tax starting in January, that if you don't show a hotel reservation, you have to pay $5. Do we really think that's going to work? I don't. In Athens, this past summer, 30,000 people a day attempting to climb up to the Acropolis in 100-degree plus Fahrenheit, not Celsius. And the Greek government's decision was, we're going to manage that by limiting it to 20,000 a day. Is that really going to work? I don't think so. How do you then spread it out? How do you and still maintain all the values that you're talking about, Jason?
Well, that's been a strategy in Europe, is trying to spread it out. But that causes more problems outside of Paris, outside of Barcelona, what have you. To me, again, it goes back to focusing on the demand side. What is good for the local population is good for the tourism business. If you look at Barcelona, the average, for every single Barcelonan, there's only 3 square meters of green space. London has 25 square meters. Amsterdam has 87 square meters of green space. The reason for that is because when they expanded Barcelona in 1860 into the Eixample, they had a fantastic plan to maximize the green space, maximize the urban space, and maximize business. So now in Barcelona, they're creating these things called super blocks. It's taking 3x3 blocks, no cars can go in, underground parking, putting greenery in these areas, and in these 9-block areas, it opens up about 8,000 square meters of green space. There's 6 of them now. There will be 230 by 2030. So 60% of Barcelona will become a walking city. And if you visit any of these areas, any of the 6 that are open now, it's a completely different city. You might be in El Raval, and all of a sudden you're in San Antonio, and you feel like you're in the countryside. And so again, what's good for the local inhabitants is good for tourism. And you see, as Tim said, it's a health check. It's a health check of your city. And so if you start putting taxes of €5 or looking at, some shops have, if you're just looking, you've got to pay some money. It's ridiculous. It's window dressing. It's trying to make the local population feel like we're doing something about over-tourism when you're not.
Well, I'll just try to pick up on that point because I think earlier I was saying that water bodies and also green spaces, as Jason also mentioned, are extremely important for both the resident and the visitor alike. There is research which shows people don't always want very large green spaces. They want accessible small spaces in different parts of the city. They can equally have as much well-being and tourism benefit as very, very large parks like you get in London, like Richmond Park and Hyde Park. But you can also do not undervalue, or I would say correctly value, the well-being benefit and the tourism benefit provided by water bodies like lakes and even small ponds and even small green spaces across the city fabric. If you walk around Seoul, you find that within a distance of about 10 minutes walk, you have about 30 to 40 coffee shops. It's full of coffee shops. I've never seen so many coffee shops anywhere. And a lot of young people say that's their public space. There is a complete lack of public space in places. And cities need to look at public space more carefully. It's not just a place where you go and you have to pay to sit and have a drink. Of course, you can also open up literally spaces in the public domain which are freely accessible and start businesses around that. Can equally be a very, very good situation. Yeah.
In a world where you could argue that seasonality no longer exists, people are not just saying, what are you doing next year? Where are you going next year? They're going, where are you going next week? Is there an opportunity here to literally spread it out over a 12-month period? Has anybody done that successfully?
Well, it's really interesting you ask that because almost all cities are looking at both seasonal and temporal distribution of tourism activities. You have, take a case of, we went for a wonderful walk last night in the palace, and it's the evening, there was a nice breeze and so on. So a lot of cities are now very carefully looking at the nighttime economy as much as the daytime economy. But fundamental to that is security, good transport, to make sure that either who are providing the tourism opportunities within the city or those who are visiting feel both safe as well as they're able to move around, particularly if it's a nighttime economy. But also there are cities, Pokhara is a good example, where we've been looking at restoration of lakes and helping communities build facilities that people can stay in to experience a place in different seasons. I would say seasons are getting more extreme in many places and unpredictable. And therefore, it's very difficult to plan for people to say, okay, I will go there and I will get the sun that I'm looking for. And this impromptu, spontaneous travel that is coming up, tourism operators and cities need to think long and hard about it because building climate into your tourism plan, building uncertainty of weather into your tourism plan is becoming really important. And even though seasonality is getting more uncertain, there are opportunities which small towns like Pokhara and Shymkent are finding that they can spread out activities across the whole year.
Well, beware of the law of unintended consequences. The pandemic helped that.
Yeah.
It allowed people to say, forget summer, I want to go now. Mm-hmm. Right? It was a certain immediacy to it. Tim, you had something to say?
Yeah, I think seasonality, we've got an interesting story over the last few years. So South Africa's positioning is essentially closely linked to Africa for a couple of reasons. We need to make sure if a visitor wants to experience safari or experience something across the African continent, Victoria Falls, the gorillas, that South Africa is always on the itinerary, that we're able to provide a broad enough range of exceptional experiences that South Africa is a must-do, right? But of course, we had a big problem, particularly in the south, around seasonality because of the rainy season. The rainy season is much, much shorter. Famously, I told the story earlier, we're getting a lot less rain. So the climate is sunnier for more of the year. Secondly, we were successfully able to open up new markets in the Middle East who actually wanting to come in the cooler seasons. And then the third reason, Peter, is Americans. We deliberately targeted new flights to the US. And the Americans travel in June, July.
United Airlines.
Exactly, and Delta now. So I think it was a combination of things we couldn't predict, like climate change, but also deliberate marketing that positioned us as increasingly less susceptible to negative seasonality. And the other thing that many people don't realize is our biggest market by far in South Africa is actually other African travelers who are coming for shopping, which speaks to urban tourism, and essentially is a significant chunk of our economy in the north of the country is effectively a tourism-driven supply chain into the rest of the continent.
So if I hear you correctly, you've come up with a new marketing campaign based on the unintended consequences of global warming. Come visit us, we're sunnier. just checking.
That's it. You've got to do the best with the hand you're dealt.
Last question before we run out of time, and that is, we talk about people limiting the numbers or trying to manage the numbers. Do you run the risk, if you do that, of making travel elitist and segregating out people who just either can't afford it or can't figure out the time to go? The example, of course, being Bhutan. Bhutan came in last year very boldly saying if you wanted to visit Bhutan, you had to spend a $200 per day per person surcharge to visit that destination. Guess what? Nobody came. And they just reduced it to $100. So the question is, where's your middle point? Have you figured it out?
Again, Peter, our problem right across the continent is about driving demand, and I think driving demand across different classes of travel. I think there's a lot of upside in MICE, as I said, more destinations becoming competitive and positioning themselves for the MICE business. I think the safari offering in South Africa, but really in many economies around Southern Africa, especially, and East Africa, is always going to attract and be able to provide a world-class five-star experience. But I'm really interested in South Africa being able to do that much further down the value chain. How do you provide an exceptional safari experience for a youth traveler? How do you make sure that you're managing safety so that people are willing to do self-drive around the country and see more of the country, and that you make that kind of experience more accessible to younger travelers? So I feel like that's a challenge for us in South Africa, one that we're stepping up to. And I think learning lessons from around the region on how to do that so that you're not just dependent on five-star high-end safari, that you're tapping into a much bigger part of a growing value chain right across tourism.
I'm afraid we're out of time. I just want to thank Tim, Jason, and Ripin for coming today. Please thank our panel.